11. Why C does not fail in its own terms. I shall assume that in these and other ways, C is indirectly collectively self-defeating. If we were all pure do-gooders, the outcome would be worse than it would be if we had certain other sets of motives. If we know this, C tells us that it would be wrong to cause ourselves to be, or to remain, pure do-gooders. Because C makes this claim, it is not failing in its own terms. C does not condemn itself. This defense of C is like my defense of S. It is worth pointing out one difference. S is indirectly, individually self-defeating when it is true of some person that, if he was never self-denying, this would be worse for him than if he had some other set of desires and dispositions. This would be a bad effect in S's terms, and this bad effect often occurs. There are many people whose lives are going worse because they are never, or very seldom, self-denying. C is indirectly, collectively self-defeating when it is true that, if some or all of us were pure do-gooders, this would make the outcome worse than it would be if we had certain other motives. This would be a bad effect in C's terms, but this bad effect may not occur. There are few people who are pure do-gooders. Because there are few such people, the fact that they have this disposition may not, on the whole, make the outcome worse. The bad effect in S's terms often occurs. The bad effect in C's terms may not occur. But this difference does not affect my defense of C and S. Both theories tell us not to have the dispositions that would have these bad effects. This is why S is not, and C would not be, failing in their own terms. It is irrelevant whether these bad effects actually occur. My defense of C assumes that we can change our dispositions. It may be objected that, suppose we were all pure do-gooders because we believe C, and suppose that we could not change our dispositions. These dispositions would have bad effects in C's terms, and these bad effects would be the results of our belief in C. So C would be failing in its own terms. There was a similar objection to my defense of S. I discussed these objections in section 18. 12. The ethics of fantasy. I have assumed that C is indirectly, collectively self-defeating. I have assumed that, if we were all pure do-gooders, the outcome would be worse than it would be if we had certain other sets of motives. If this claim is true, C tells us that we should try to have one of these other sets of motives. Whether this claim is true is in part a factual question. I believe that it is probably true, but I shall not try to show this here. It seems more worthwhile to discuss what this claim implies. I also believe that, even if we became convinced that consequentialism was the best moral theory, most of us would not, in fact, become pure do-gooders. Because he makes a similar assumption, Mackey calls act utilitarianism the ethics of fantasy. Like several other writers, he assumes that we should reject a moral theory if it is in this sense unrealistically demanding. If it is true, even if we all accepted this theory, most of us would in fact seldom do what this theory claims that we ought to do. Mackey believes that a moral theory is something that we invent. If this is so, it is plausible to claim that an acceptable theory cannot be unrealistically demanding. But, on several other views about the nature of morality, this claim is not plausible. We may hope that the best theory is not unrealistically demanding, but on these views, this can only be a hope. We cannot assume that this must be true. Suppose that I am wrong to assume that C is indirectly, collectively, self-defeating. Even if this is false, we can plausibly assume that C is unrealistically demanding. Even if it would not make the outcome worse if we were all pure do-gooders, it is probably causally impossible that all or most of us become pure do-gooders. Though these are quite different assumptions, they have the same implication. If it is causally impossible that we become pure do-gooders, C again implies that we ought to try to have one of the best possible sets of motives, in consequentialist terms. This implication is therefore worth discussing if 1. C is either indirectly self-defeating or unrealistically demanding, or both, and 2. Neither of these facts would show that C cannot be the best theory. Though I am not yet convinced that C is the best theory, I believe both 1 and 2.